Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. No ifs, came Taoist Heavenspan's cold voice from within the black light, as he shot directly toward the Saint Emperor. In the final moment, just before Taoist Heavenspan was about to hit him, the Saint Emperor's eyes flashed with madness. The truth was that he could have held back and not come to fight, and in fact, the moment he had opened his eyes earlier, he had known that he was not a match for Taoist Heavenspan. But this was his home, and he was the Saint Emperor, whose Tao came from the Eternal Mother. And an even more important factor in his decision was Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun had chosen a different path from him, something that he didn't understand early on. However, now he was enlightened. Having received the approval of the Eternal Mother, he knew that Bai Xiaochun was choosing a path of incomprehensible difficulty. His Tao had nothing to do with anyone else. His Tao was his own, and thus, if he achieved it, would exist on a different level, similar to the mortal renegades. The Saint Emperor knew he couldn't defeat Taoist Heavenspan, and yet, came to fight anyway. He would rather self-detonate, killing himself in body and soul, if the result was causing even a slight delay for Taoist Heavenspan. However, before the Saint Emperor could do anything else, and even as the black beam of light that was Taoist Heavenspan was about to hit him, a beam of Archean luminescence suddenly shot through the air. Then came a second, a third, and a fourth. In the blink of an eye, 300 beams of Archean luminescence were shooting toward Taoist Heavenspan, all of them bursting with Archean levels of power. Although one such beam might not be very frightening to Taoist Heavenspan, the power of so many of them combined instantly stopped him in his tracks. Even more importantly, whether it was the Saint Emperor or Taoist Heavenspan, and in fact, to all cultivators of the eternal immortal domains, Archean luminescence represented one thing. Bai Xiaochun, the Saint Emperor breathed, looking up into the sky. Bai Xiaochun. A very serious expression appeared on Taoist Heavenspan's face, and he also looked up into the sky, toward a shocking burst of energy that was approaching from beyond the heavens. They weren't the only ones to react in such a way. In Arch-Emperor City, Song Junwan, Hu Xiaomei, Zhou Zimo and Gong Sunwan are all looked up with wide, disbelieving eyes. Meanwhile, Xiaoxiao, Dabao and Xiaoxiao looked over at Bai Xiaochun's secluded meditation facilities, as did the Grand Heaven Master and other powerful experts. All of them were unsure of what was happening. However, considering that so many of them recognized Bai Xiaochun's Archean luminescence, they all began to get excited. It's the Arch-Emperor. The Arch-Emperor is out of seclusion. As the cheering rose up, Taoist Heavenspan frowned. After all, the incoming energy was incredibly powerful, but at the same time, didn't seem to be what he remembered Bai Xiaochun's energy feeling like. The Saint Emperor could also sense that something strange was going on. That was when they both caught sight of an enormous fan moving toward the eternal immortal domains at top speed, causing rumbling sounds to fill the air. It was none other than Bai Xiaochun's treasured fan. Visible in the fan face, within the tower that housed the essence left behind by the worldly Taoist, was Song Qiu's corpse, sitting there cross-legged. His face was pale, and he looked dead. However, in addition to the aura of death that radiated out from him, there was also a powerful life force. Furthermore, the Tao essence of life and death which had once permeated the tower was gone, and existed instead inside of Song Ke. A sigil could be seen on his forehead, which was none other than the face of the worldly Taoist. Close examination would reveal that it resembled Song Qiu's face to a large degree, the reason being that the worldly Taoist had already perished, and Song Ke had absorbed his Tao. Although he now possessed the worldly Taoist's mark, it was his own, and he could control it. As the fan neared, Taoist Heavenspan's eyes narrowed, and the crowds cheered. And that was when Song Qiu's eyes opened. One of them was black, the other was white, and neither had pupils. At the same time, the sigil on his forehead radiated glittering light, and he erupted with a sovereign aura. He rose to his feet, two tempests raging around him as he stepped forward off of the fan. He vanished, reappearing in the eternal immortal domains. Right in front of Taoist Heavenspan. "You shall not pass," he said, his voice grim. The sight of his black and white eyes caused Taoist Heavenspan's pupils to constrict. As for the Saint Emperor, he didn't recognize Song Ke, and yet, could hear Song Jiwan crying out from within Arch-Emperor City. "Care." Song Ke heard her call, and looked down at her, a smile playing out on his grim face. In that moment, Taoist Heavenspan turned into a black blur that shot directly toward him. "The Tao of Nirvanic extermination?" Song Ke said. "I see the calmness of Nirvana here, but no extermination." With that, he waved his hand, causing a black light to spring up that deeply resembled the black light being used by Taoist Heavenspan. Then, without any hesitation, he began to fight. A boom rang out as Taoist Heavenspan's form of black light shuddered for the first time, and he appeared in bodily form, staggering backward a few paces, staring at Song Ke with a look of shock in his eyes. Eyes flashing, Song Ke said, "The essence of life and death was prepared by the worldly Taoist, both to resurrect the object of his love, and also to resist the mortal renegade. I'm not sure whether it's strong enough to fight the mortal renegade, but it's more than strong enough to fight you." With that, he blurred into motion as he shot toward Taoist Heavenspan. Expression brightening, the Saint Emperor flew forward and joined forces with Song Ke. Two half-sovereigns were now a flurry of attacks, crushing Taoist Heavenspan over and over again. In only a few breaths' worth of time, a string of massive booms rang out to shake heaven and earth. Then, the three of them began to rise higher and higher into the air, until they were in the starry sky outside of the eternal immortal domains, where they continued to fight. Taoist Heavenspan was the strongest of them all. However, he was having trouble dealing with Song Ke's essence magic, and was sustaining injuries. If he had been fighting with Song Ke alone, then it might not have been a big problem, but he also had the Saint Emperor to deal with. He was fighting two half-sovereigns, one of whom was using tactics specifically designed to fight against him. It was impossible for him to regain the upper hand. After all, when half-sovereigns fought, even the slightest slip-up could lead to drastic consequences. Blood sprayed out of Taoist Heavenspan's mouth as he fell back over and over again. Sometimes, he managed to dodge out of the way of Song Ke's Tao essence of life and death, only to slam into the divine abilities of the eternal flower, wielded by the Saint Emperor. Taoist Heavenspan coughed up a mouthful of blood, and prepared to flee, only to see Song Ke wave his hand, and summon the fan, which shot toward him and shrank down for him to grab it. Because Song Ke possessed the Tao essence of life and death, he could use the most orthodox legacy techniques of the worldly Taoist. Even the spirit automaton Bai Xiaochun would follow his orders, which was something that Bai Xiaochun could never have imagined would happen. Unless Bai Xiaochun specifically interfered and prohibited it, Bai Xiaochun would do anything that Song Ke asked him to do. The shrunken fan appeared in front of Song Ke, who grabbed it and waved it out in front of him. Instantly, a huge river swept forth, filling the starry sky so quickly that Taoist Heavenspan was overwhelmed, and found it impossible to escape. Next, a lonely boat appeared, shining with Archean luminescence. The two Archean slaves on the boat immediately leapt forth to attack, and yet, things weren't over yet. Much to the consternation of Taoist Heavenspan, the Taoist pagoda of life and death appeared in the starry sky, along with the mountain that housed it. They were joined by an enormous sovereign's arm. This was the true might of this magical item. The river that flowed through the starry sky seemed to contain sealing power that perfectly conformed to Song Ke's Tao essence of life and death. Although it was not at the level that the worldly Taoist could have utilized, it was close. And no matter how Taoist Heavenspan screamed and fought, he couldn't escape. And that was when the mountain and the sovereign's arm began to crush down toward him. Taoist Heavenspan had inherited the Tao of the mortal renegade, and become his personal apprentice. With the requisite approval, he had become a half-sovereign, and yet, as of this moment, he was nearly overwhelmed with a sensation of deadly crisis. Of the two enemies he faced, both were half-sovereigns like himself. Although the Saint Emperor wasn't enough on his own, Song Ke had already died in the past. Later, Bai Xiaochun placed him in the tower with the Tao essence of life and death, with which he conformed perfectly. After absorbing it, something which was foul and rotten was turned into something rare and magical, and he was able to live again within death. The moment he opened his eyes, he became the apprentice of the worldly Taoist. And in fact, had the worldly Taoist not already perished, then when Song Ke awoke, he wouldn't have been a half-sovereign, but a true sovereign. In this respect, he was somewhat similar to Taoist Heavenspan. However, the main difference between the two was that the mortal renegade still existed, whereas the worldly Taoist was no more. Unfortunately for Taoist Heavenspan, the mortal renegade was still asleep, and therefore, despite having his approval, it wasn't possible for him to become a sovereign. He was only able to take half a step into that level. When the mortal renegade awoke, Taoist Heavenspan could use his power to completely step into the sovereign realm. Although he would still pale in comparison to the mortal renegade, he would still be a sovereign. But now, it seemed unlikely that Taoist Heavenspan would survive until the mortal renegade woke up. The fight between him and Song Ke seemed almost like a continuation of the feud between the mortal renegade and the worldly Taoist. And unluckily for Taoist Heavenspan, he was actually facing two opponents, who as of this moment, had the clear advantage over him. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes were bright red as he began to fight anxiously. He now had no choice but to do everything he could to gain an advantage. Biting the tip of his tongue, he spat out 7 mouthfuls of blood, each one causing his hair to turn whiter and his body to shrivel. By the end, he looked like a crazed old man. "Sovereign," he shouted, his voice thrumming with what seemed like the power of natural law. As the ripples of his voice spread out, a vortex sprang up on the forehead of the enormous mortal renegade, who loomed behind him there in the starry sky. Then, a stream of divine sense shot out from the vortex. The heaven-shaking, earth-shattering divine sense contained a powerful aura of both nirvanic extermination and ultimate death, which covered everything, creating an attack that Song Ke and the Saint Emperor had no hope of defending against. Rumbling sounds could be heard as they coughed up blood, then staggered backward, out of control, blood oozing out of their eyes, ears, noses, and mouths. The divine sense was just too strong. It didn't matter that they were half-sovereigns, they simply couldn't stand up to it. Thankfully, it was only one quick blast of divine sense, otherwise, Taoist Heavenspan wouldn't have needed to expend any more effort to seriously injure them. It was divine sense straight from the mortal renegade, which Taoist Heavenspan had paid a huge price to unleash as a trump card. It wasn't that he didn't wish to unleash more of it. Unfortunately for him, the mortal renegade was asleep, and could therefore only release a small portion of his divine sense. Although it quickly faded away, the Saint Emperor and Song Ke were shaken all the way down to their souls, and were temporarily stunned, to the point where they had nothing separating themselves from Taoist Heavenspan. And that brief opening was all that Taoist Heavenspan had hoped for. Without any hesitation, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, causing balls of 300-meter-tall black smoke to appear, one in each hand. Then, he launched the 2 balls of smoke at Song Ke and the Saint Emperor. "Die," Taoist Heavenspan said in a cold voice. The 2 balls of smoke pulsed with a voracious power that seemed to want to consume anything it touched. Upon seeing that, the eyes of both Song Ke and the Saint Emperor widened. The smoke almost seemed to be alive, especially considering the howls which erupted from inside them. In fact, looking closely at them would reveal that red light glowed inside of them. Taoist Heavenspan was clearly putting everything on the line. Those 2 balls of smoke were not ordinary in nature, and Taoist Heavenspan himself was severely withered from the effort of unleashing them. In order to unleash the power of essence here, he had drawn heavily upon his own life force and his soul. "We can't let it touch us." That was what both Song Ke and the Saint Emperor were thinking. Even as they fell back at top speed, the smoke balls locked onto them, piercing through the void toward them at top speed. Glaring, Song Ke struck the top of his own head, injuring himself and shaking his own divine soul to gain a moment of added clarity. Without any hesitation, he sent out a stream of divine sense to summon the 2 Archean slaves. An instant later, they appeared in front of him and the Saint Emperor, standing in for them to take the blow of the 2 spheres of smoke. Everything was happening so quickly that Taoist Heavenspan had no time to change the course of the smoke spheres, which instantly slammed into the Archean slaves. When Taoist Heavenspan saw that his tactic was about to be defeated by Song Ke, his eyes burned with killing intent. He was a decisive person, and therefore, it was without any hesitation that he performed a double-handed incantation gesture and spoke in a devilish, demonic voice. "Devil Sun, Demon Moon." A howl erupted out that seemed to originate from the most ancient of times, causing heaven and earth to tremble, and the eternal immortal domains to be cast into darkness. It contained indescribable power, and as it spread out, the 2 balls of smoke consumed the Archean slaves, corroding their bodies and sucking away at their life force. In the blink of an eye, the 2 Archean slaves' souls were extracted, and their flesh and blood were completely assimilated. They had been sealed and left behind by the worldly Taoist, but now, the worldly Taoist was dead. And thanks to this bizarre magical technique unleashed by Taoist Heavenspan, they could not defend against the smoke. As that happened, the 2 balls of smoke began to transform, growing larger and more shockingly powerful, until they resembled a shining sun and a full moon. When that happened, the cultivators of the eternal immortal domains suddenly felt so much pressure weighing down on them that they couldn't breathe. Although many of them couldn't see what was happening, the Grand Heaven Master and other Celestials could. And they knew that if Taoist Heavenspan could turn the tables here, it would be devastating. Taoist Heavenspan, if it weren't for him, there wouldn't have been so many deaths when the Heavenspan realm entered the eternal immortal domains. He's the one that made us pay the steepest of prices. Everyone had various feelings about Taoist Heavenspan, but for the most part, all of them hated him as much as Bai Xiaochun. And yet, they all had to admit that he really was a spectacular cultivator. He had incredible natural talents, and had built up enough power in the original Heavenspan realm that he nearly brought an end to the bloodline of the arch-ancestor. To leave that realm, he had ignored family love, and had been willing to sacrifice anything and everything to destroy the body of the arch-ancestor. He could only be described as ambitious and ruthless. And that had led him to a position of cultivation base power that few people could challenge. Therefore, although many people hated him, all of them had to admit that he was incredibly strong. Furthermore, it would be easier to find a phoenix feather or a Qilin horn than to find someone who could react as decisively as he had just now, in a moment of profoundly deadly crisis. As Taoist Heavenspan was turning the tables in his fight, the last dandelion seeds that contained Bai Xiaochun's life force and divine sense were landing in the most distant regions of the void. In roughly a third of the regions that had been reached, moonflowers had already bloomed, and were shining with bright light. As of this moment, it was almost a visible contest between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Beneath the starry sky that now covered the eternal immortal domains, Taoist Heavenspan had almost completely turned the tables in the fight. His hair and clothes whipped about as he manipulated his devil sun and demon moon, and from a distance, he pulsed with such shocking energy that he seemed completely invincible. However, he was still not completely out of danger. The enormous river Song Ke had summoned still threatened him, as did the huge go board from the lonely boat. There was also the mountain of Tao essence, and the enormous sovereign's arm. Both Song Ke and the Saint Emperor were now out of sorts, especially Song Ke, whose divine soul had been nearly ripped apart because of the loss of the Archean slaves. Although he wanted to continue to control the various aspects of the fan, his divine soul was in too poor of a state, and therefore, he had to rely on Bai Xiaochun. Although Bai Xiaochun couldn't control things at the same level that he could, there was no other choice. Sending some divine sense into the fan in his hand, Song Ke passed a message to Bai Xiaochun. A moment later, he sat down cross-legged, panting as he tried to recover from his injuries. Looking over at the Saint Emperor, he said, "I need 30 breaths of time." Then he closed his eyes. Sensing the bad state Song Ke was in, the Saint Emperor immediately began to stand as Dharma protector for him. Meanwhile, Taoist Heavenspan was in the middle of that vast river, his head thrown back, unleashing a howl that surpassed heavenly thunder. Thrusting his hands forward, he held the sun and the moon out in front of him as he shot through the river, seemingly just on the verge of destroying it. The devil sun and the demon moon radiated dazzling light as Taoist Heavenspan became like a sharp arrow, slicing through the river. He knew that time was of the essence. If Song Ke recovered in time, then he would be in great danger, and therefore, he held nothing back in his attempt to gain complete control of the flow of battle. "Be destroyed," he shouted, his eyes flashing. However, even as his devil sun and demon moon flashed with bright light, and the huge river began to vibrate, a shout could be heard from Bai Xiaochun in the fan, as he took control of the go board. The go board immediately vanished, then reappeared a moment later in front of Taoist Heavenspan, shining with blinding light. It was the light of 361 shots of Archean luminescence, which shot out from the various go pieces on the game board. Each and every one of them thrummed with the power of the great circle of the Archean realm. Although they did not match up individually to Taoist Heavenspan, who was a half-sovereign, their combined force was enough to light his eyes up with shock. The 361 beams of Archean luminescence slammed into Taoist Heavenspan's devil sun and demon moon, causing a deafening boom to echo out, as well as a shockwave that spread out through the starry sky. The mighty devil sun and demon moon began to collapse, and Taoist Heavenspan knew that if that process completed, he would be out of options, and his bid to regain control of the battle would end. Mouth of nirvanic extermination. Eyes bloodshot, he struck the top of his head, causing a stream of blood to spray out of his mouth. At the same time, he performed another double-handed incantation gesture, seemingly stopping time, causing the collapse of the devil sun and demon moon to stop. At the same time, a vortex sprang into being in front of him. The vortex was even larger than the sun and moon, and when it appeared, was little more than a swath of pitch black. It pulsed with a feeling of death, as well as nirvanic extermination, and at the same time, began to drag everything in the area toward it. It almost looked like an enormous mouth, and it was so powerful that not even the go pieces on the game board could resist its power, and they began to inch toward it. The entire go board itself also began to vibrate, whereupon Taoist Heavenspan let out a powerful shout, causing it to shatter. In the blink of an eye, Taoist Heavenspan suddenly turned into what seemed like the most paragon entity in all creation. Although his aura had been severely weakened, his devil sun and demon moon could consume anything they touched, and were not growing any weaker. Their fluctuations were as terrifying as ever as Taoist Heavenspan used them to batter the river once again. Inside the fan, Bai Xiaochun's eyes went bloodshot at the sight of the go-board being destroyed. Shrieking at the top of his lungs, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, unleashing the power of his divine sense to exercise control over the lonely boat. Instantly, the boat floating in the river began to shine with astonishing silver light, something almost like a flying sword that pierced through the river toward Taoist Heavenspan. It was so bright that everyone down in the eternal immortal domains could see it clearly. It was not a real flying sword. However, as the light shot out from the lonely boat, cracking sounds could be heard, followed by a massive self-detonation. Bai Xiaochun understood that his best option was to use the boat to stop Taoist Heavenspan. And he also knew that he couldn't hold back. Detonating the boat, he used its power to attack Taoist Heavenspan, not to block him indefinitely, but at least for a dozen or so breaths of time. As of this moment, only 10 breaths of time had passed since Song Ke began to repair his divine soul. To ordinary cultivators, 10 breaths of time was not a long time. But to Taoist Heavenspan and Song Ke, many things could happen in that amount of time, and many types of deadly situations could be completely reversed. You have no chance of succeeding. Taoist Heavenspan roared, his hands flashing in an incantation gesture. Suddenly, the devil sun, demon moon, and the enormous mouth twisted and distorted as the outline of a face became visible. It was as if the devil sun and demon moon had become eyes, right below which was that enormous mouth. Intense rumbling filled heaven and earth as the power of the self-detonation of the boat slammed into it like a flying sword. Deafening booms echoed out. The power of the self-detonation caused blood to spray wildly out of Taoist Heavenspan's mouth, and yet, couldn't do anything to the outline of the face. In fact, the face crushed the countless chunks of the lonely boat, and proceeded onward unhindered. It was almost impossible to describe how quickly it moved, and before Bai Xiaochun could do anything to the river, the face slammed into it. The face caused the river to stretch and distort, to the point where its water almost seemed like skin of the surface of the face. As its facial features became visible, it was possible for the people in the eternal immortal domains to see it, and they quickly recognized who it was. The enemy from beyond, the sovereign giant. It most definitely was the face of the mortal renegade. And it caused the flowering waters of the river to slowly drain away, which in turn caused Taoist Heavenspan's eyes to light up with joy. And that was when the tolling of a bell could suddenly be heard from the depths of the eternal lands. The will of the Eternal Mother appeared, rushing out into the eternal immortal domains, causing the Saint Emperor to shiver and to shine with glittering light. Her glowing sigil appeared on his forehead, a flower that seemed to be blooming and bearing fruit, a fruit that resembled an open eye. The Eternal Mother was waking up of her own accord. She was not using her power to wake up and fight the mortal renegade. Instead, she was focusing all her energy on stopping Taoist Heavenspan, and protecting Bai Xiaochun. Perhaps the Eternal Mother had sensed that Bai Xiaochun's pursuit of his own Tao was the only hope for her and the eternal immortal domains. If he failed, then the eternal immortal domains would be doomed, and no one would be able to save them. After all, even when she was in her prime, the eternal immortal domains could only delay the inevitable catastrophe, not prevent it completely. But if Bai Xiaochun could succeed in his search for his own Tao, then although there would still be many variables at play, there would at least be hope for the future. Therefore, how could she possibly allow someone to disturb him in a critical moment of cultivation? Years had passed since she was originally injured, and left with only a bit of godly power, most of which she had given out to approve of celestials, or to help the Saint Emperor. However, she still had a bit left to make a move in this critical moment. Without any hesitation whatsoever, she sent her will out into the eternal immortal domains, shaking all living beings, and causing the mark on the Saint Emperor's forehead to shine with dazzling light. Dazzling light spread out in all directions as the eternal flower on the Saint Emperor's forehead became the eye of the Eternal Mother, which then opened. Instantly, the Saint Emperor's aura rose with explosive speed. Before, his cultivation base had been somewhat unstable, but now, it stabilized, and actually stepped all the way into the sovereign realm. Rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth as an aura that represented natural laws of heaven and earth erupted out, causing the heavens to grow dim, and the starry sky to distort. Clearly, this newfound power of the Saint Emperor came from the Eternal Mother, and would not last for long. However, it was still enough to cause Taoist Heavenspan's face to fall. The Eternal Mother had chosen to act in the most critical of moments. Damn it, he growled, his face twisted with madness as he charged through the enormous river. All he needed was a few breaths worth of time, and yet, how could the Eternal Mother possibly give him that? As the Saint Emperor's aura grew more powerful, his eyes flashed, and he shot through the river to appear in front of the projected face of the mortal renegade. Reaching out, he then thrust his palm at the face. "Back off," he roared. That simple gesture was backed by the power of a sovereign, and caused the waters of the river to roil violently and sweep away in the opposite direction. At the same time, the face of the mortal renegade twisted and distorted, and was shoved backward, powerless to resist. "I refuse to accept this," Taoist Heavenspan shouted, blood pouring out of his mouth. He had paid a heavy price, and unleashed his most powerful trump cards, even damaging his life force and his soul, all in an attempt to turn the tables in this critical moment. But then the Eternal Mother came, and casually destroyed his chance. How could he not feel defiant? Slapping his palm onto his chest, he caused black flames to erupt all over him. Those flames represented nirvanic extermination, and ultimate death. They represented a darkness that burned, not the enemy, but Taoist Heavenspan himself. Shockingly, he didn't hesitate for even a moment to light himself on fire, to make himself even stronger than before. He had no other alternatives. Worse, he had the intense premonition that if he didn't do this, he would be killed beyond the shadow of a doubt. However, if he could somehow manage to get back to the mortal renegade's forehead, then perhaps he could borrow some power to heal himself. 3,000 Taos of Nirvanic Extermination. Hands flying through double-handed incantation gestures, he caused something like a thread to appear, seemingly formed from natural law itself. It almost looked like a hair attached to the face of the mortal renegade. That hair was indeed a natural law, thrumming with the power of essence, one of many which existed in the starry sky. This was not something Taoist Heavenspan had gained enlightenment from, but rather, something from the mortal renegade. As the mortal renegade had exterminated one flourishing civilization after another, he had taken everything which made them up and transformed it into essence power. Normally speaking, Taoist Heavenspan should not have been able to use the mortal renegade's magics of nirvanic extermination. However, by burning his own body, he managed to do it. Moments later, a second hair appeared, then a third, and a fourth. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of hairs had appeared, and then, over 1,000. As they did, the power of natural law and essence caused the sky to tremble, and shook all of the living beings present. The river began to evaporate, until the point when the 3,000th great Tao appeared. 3,000 hairs could be seen, which then turned blurry as they transformed into dozens of smaller hairs that almost seemed like clones of the originals. These were the countless lesser Taos that existed within the great essence Taos, all of them originating with the mortal renegade. 3,000 great Taos and countless lesser Taos formed together into an all-destructive power. The devil sun and demon moon eyes within the projected face of the mortal renegade then began to glow bright red, almost as if they were alive. "Nobody can stop me," Taoist Heavenspan howled from within the flames. Surrounded by the illusory face of the mortal renegade with its countless hairs of natural law, he continued to charge through the river. He was now vastly stronger than before, and as such, almost instantly shot through the river to appear in front of the Saint Emperor. The Saint Emperor had nothing else to do. The symbol of the Eternal Mother on his forehead glittered, emitting an explosive aura as he performed a double-handed incantation gesture. As a result, the Eternal Flower appeared behind him, which then fought with full force against the projected face of the mortal renegade. A rumbling boom echoed out when they made contact, causing the lands of the eternal immortal domains to tremble, and the sky to sink in. Blood sprayed out of Taoist Heavenspan's mouth, and his body withered even further. By now, the flame of his life force was very dark. Obviously, the Eternal Mother's move had drained him to the point where he was about to flicker out of existence. However, the divine abilities he was unleashing came from the mortal renegade. So in some ways, even if he died, they would continue on. Therefore, even though the Eternal Mother's power rebuffed the face of the mortal renegade, sending it tumbling back into the river, the Saint Emperor was deeply shaken, and staggered backward several paces. At the same time, the eye of the Eternal Mother went dark and closed. Something like a sigh of regret echoed through heaven and earth. Back in the Eternal Mother's prime, she might not have been able to stand up to the mortal renegade, but she could have easily sealed an apprentice of his like Taoist Heavenspan. But now, all she was capable of was 2 counter-attacks before she was so weak that she had to return to slumber. The moment that the Eternal Mother's eye closed, the Saint Emperor's aura grew weaker. Coughing up blood, he staggered backward several steps, face turning ashen. As of this moment, Taoist Heavenspan's immense strength had caused despair to rise up in his heart. If the apprentice is this strong, then exactly how powerful is the mortal renegade himself? As the Saint Emperor backed up, racked with bitterness, Taoist Heavenspan looked over, aware that his life force was draining away, and thus descending into madness. Surrounded by the projected face with its 3,000 hairs, he once again prepared to charge through the river. As of this moment, there was no one to stop him. Clearly, he would make it through without any problems. But then, Song Ke opened his eyes, and they shone with dazzling brightness. Hands flashing in a double-handed incantation gesture, he said, "Mountain of Tao Essence. Crush him." This world technically did contain a bit of chi flow, in much the same way that the immortal world had contained just a scrap, which Bai Xiaochun took away and used to reach the Archean realm. But now, none of that chi flow was available for Taoist Heavenspan. As soon as Song Ke awoke, he performed an incantation gesture, sending the mountain of Tao essence rumbling through the river with crushing force toward Taoist Heavenspan. Taoist Heavenspan had just been about to start another charge, only to find the mountain now barreling toward him. Furthermore, Song Ke took control of the river, causing it to seemingly come to life. Instantly, the flow of the river reversed, simultaneously shifting to encircle Taoist Heavenspan. At the same time, the mountain of Tao essence expanded, growing tremendously large and radiating the power of essence as it descended. Damn it, although the projected face of the mortal renegade could withstand the force, Taoist Heavenspan, who was already in bad shape, could only look on in despair, blood oozing out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. He struggled, but in vain. The mountain of Tao essence continued to fall, causing deafening rumbling sounds to echo through the air. Trapped by the river, Taoist Heavenspan let loose a piercing cry of defiance. He still had many unfinished plans, and had not yet become a true sovereign. He even had a more far-reaching plot in the works, and therefore, simply could not believe that he would die in this moment. Even worse, he wasn't even fighting Bai Xiaochun. He might have been able to accept a loss in that scenario, but instead, he was fighting a nameless nobody, which was a humiliation worse than death. Finally, he chuckled bitterly and lowered his head. He was now wreathed in such intense flames that his face wasn't even visible, making him seem like nothing more than a conglomeration of fire. "Bai Xiaochun," he growled, his eyes flashing, almost as if his vision could pierce all the way down to the eternal immortal domains, and into a certain private chamber in the imperial palace of Arch-Emperor City. It was almost as if he could see Bai Xiaochun there, meditating. Even as Bai Xiaochun's name escaped his lips, he threw his arms wide, causing more shocking flames to erupt out from inside of him. Obviously, he had been holding just a little bit back earlier, and had only burned his flesh and blood and life force. However, he had not burned his soul or the Tao that he had acquired from the mortal renegade. But now, he didn't care. He burned soul and Tao alike, causing a raging sea of flames to spread out in all directions, accompanied by a howl of pain. Nirvanic extermination projection. As flames rippled off of him, they connected to the projection of the mortal renegade's face, forming together into the projection of a body. As of this moment, there was a full, bodily version of the mortal renegade right there. Taoist Heavenspan was using a divine ability to burn himself into nothing, all in exchange for a trump card from within the Tao of Nirvanic extermination. He had to pay an extremely heavy price, but in exchange, gained stupefying levels of power. As the mountain of Tao essence arrived, he howled in a deafening voice that shook the starry sky, and caused the entire world to shake. "Get the hell out of here." As a projected incarnation of the mortal renegade, Taoist Heavenspan threw his arms out, sending out force that slammed into the mountain, causing cracks to spread out on its surface, and then destroying it. Even as the fragments of the mountain continued to explode out in all directions, he clenched his fiery hand into a fist and unleashed a punch. Indescribably powerful fluctuations spread out, causing the river to tremble, and sending innumerable water droplets flying out into the starry sky. As all creation shook, Taoist Heavenspan guided his projected incarnation to flee directly toward the true form of the mortal renegade. His ultimate goal was simply to live. He had ignited his soul in Tao, and it would take a long, long time to recover from that. But in the end, he still wanted to continue living. Inside of the fan was Bai Xiaochun, whose vital energy had been badly damaged. When he saw what was happening, he let out a miserable cry. As for Song Ke, his eyes flashed with anger, and powerful fluctuations rolled off of him. In response to the fluctuations, the sovereign's arms suddenly blazed with shining light like that of a sun. Immense power shot out, sweeping through the starry sky to the point where it bent under the force. And its target was none other than Taoist Heavenspan. The projection of the mortal renegade's body immediately began to shake and twist, causing Taoist Heavenspan to go completely mad. Taoist Heavenspan's life was already teetering unstably, and yet, things weren't over yet. After bashing him with the sovereign's arm, Song Ke looked over with bloodshot eyes and sent forth more powerful fluctuations. Shockingly, he also began to burn himself. I'm not dead yet, Heavenspan, you schmuck. Fire blazed as he rose to his feet, using his life force, his Tao essence, and everything else that made him up to summon an enormous, illusory giant around him. It was a figure wearing a Taoist robe, who was immensely handsome, and had eyes like starlight. If Bai Xiaochun were here, he would recognize this person immediately. The form Song Ke had summoned was none other than the worldly Taoist. Reaching out, he pulled all of the water droplets from the huge river back to him, causing them to form the flesh and blood of the huge giant. As of this moment, the worldly Taoist looked completely lifelike. Next, he reached out with his other hand, causing the fragments of the mountain of Tao essence to pull back together and hover to his right. Inside of the treasured fan, Bai Xiaochi looked on with excitement as he sent the fan flying over to the worldly Taoist's left side. Despite the time it takes to describe all of these things, they happened in the time it takes a spark to fly off of a piece of flint. Even as Taoist Heavenspan made his break, Song Ke unleashed this divine ability and stepped forward to block his path. Song Ke was almost like the living incarnation of the worldly Taoist, causing the sky to tremble, as he shot toward Taoist Heavenspan. Die! He howled, his eyes blazing with madness. After all, Bai Xiaochun wasn't the only one to hate Taoist Heavenspan. Song Ke was also from the Heavenspan realm, and hated the man all the way down to his bones. As the incarnation of the worldly Taoist closed in, he clenched his right hand into a fist and punched out toward Taoist Heavenspan. It contained everything that made up Song Ke, and caused the worldly Taoist's image to become a dazzling shooting star as he blazed through the starry sky. Taoist Heavenspan's face fell. If the sovereign's arm hadn't bent space in the area, he might have been able to make it to his destination. But now there was no time. In this moment of deadly crisis, he laughed bitterly, spun in place, and threw both hands out in an incantation gesture. Instantly, a black vortex appeared between the two hands of the mortal renegade's incarnation. Without any hesitation, he shoved that vortex toward the incoming worldly Taoist. Rumbling sounds echoed out that surpassed anything in the battle up to this point, shaking the surrounding void until it shattered. It almost seemed like the entire starry sky would collapse. Down in the eternal immortal domains, mountains toppled over, and the eternal sea spilled into the surrounding lands. It was like a terrifying black hole had been created right between Song Ke and Taoist Heavenspan, right between the projected incarnations of the worldly Taoist and the mortal renegade. Eventually, Taoist Heavenspan's projection couldn't last any longer, and the black flames collapsed. At the same time, the image of the worldly Taoist around Song Ke also fell to pieces. Song Ke tumbled back, blood spraying wildly out of his mouth. He had done everything he could, and was now like a candle in the wind, just on the verge of perishing. Thankfully, the Saint Emperor was there, and despite the injuries he had sustained, managed to grab Song Ke, and then fall back. As for Taoist Heavenspan, as soon as the projection of the mortal renegade faded away, he appeared there in the starry sky, hair disheveled, face pale. Although no more flames were visible on his person, they were there inside of him, eating away at the last bits of life force he had left. He suddenly felt very calm. He was no longer thinking about Song Ke, the Saint Emperor, or the countless living beings of the eternal immortal domains. Nor was he thinking about Bai Xiaochun. Instead, he was looking at a certain location in the eternal immortal domains. Daddy, is it worth it? I'm your daughter. I beg you, Daddy. I beg you. He heard Du Lingfei's words from years ago, back in the moment that he had attempted to force her and Bai Xiaochun to fuse together on Heavenspan Island. Was it? He murmured to himself. Was it worth it? All of a sudden, he felt a twinge of pain on the back of his hand, and looked down to see a drop of liquid there. It was a tear, and at the moment, he had no idea how it got there. But as soon as it had touched his searing flesh, it caused pain to wash through him. And then, as he looked, his hand faded away into ash. Then his arm, and the effects continued to spread. I wasn't always like this, was I? He thought. He closed his eyes, bitter and confused. Gradually, his head turned to ash along with the rest of his body. As it did, his memories vanished, as did those final words that his daughter had spoken to him. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.